Somewhere above you, right now, the sky is doing what it has always done. It is vast, it is quiet, and it holds, depending on who you ask, either nothing unusual at all or everything. For as long as human beings have looked upward, they have seen things they could not explain. Lights that moved too fast, objects that hovered without sound, shapes that disappeared before anyone could get a second look. Some of these sightings were written off as weather, or aircraft, or tricks of the atmosphere. Some were investigated by governments and quietly filed away. And some were never explained at all. Today, we are going to walk through all of it. Over the next 2 hours, we will explore every major UFO conspiracy, claim, and story that people have told, from the most famous cases you have probably already heard of, to the stranger, quieter theories that exist at the edges of what most people are willing to consider. We will look at what governments have said, what witnesses have reported, what researchers have argued, and what skeptics have countered. You do not need to believe any of it. This is not an argument. It is not trying to change your mind. It is simply a long, unhurried walk through one of the most enduring mysteries in human history. Some of what you hear will feel familiar, some of it will feel strange, and some of it will sit quietly in that in-between place, the place where certainty ends and curiosity begins. That is, perhaps, the most interesting place of all. Let's start at the beginning. The grounding. Before we get into the theories, and there are many, it helps to understand the foundation, what we actually know, what the word UFO actually means, and why for decades this subject has refused to go away. The term UFO stands for Unidentified Flying Object. That is all it means. It does not mean alien spacecraft. It does not mean extraterrestrial life. It means, simply, an object in the sky that the person observing it cannot identify. By that definition, UFOs are real. They have always been real. They were real before anyone had a theory about them. They will be real as long as human beings look upward and encounter things they cannot immediately explain. The question that divides people is not whether unidentified objects exist in the sky. They do, but what those objects actually are. That distinction matters more than it might seem, because a lot of what you will hear tonight lives in the space between two very different statements. The first statement is, we don't know what this is. The second is, therefore, it must be from another world. Those two statements are not the same. The gap between them is wide. And it is in that gap, that honest, unresolved, fascinating gap, where the most interesting conversations happen. It is also where a great deal of the confusion lives, a great deal of the disagreement, and, if we are being truthful, a great deal of the wonder. A brief history of looking up human beings have been recording unusual things in the sky for thousands of years, long before the phrase flying saucer existed, long before governments had agencies to investigate aerial phenomena, long before there were cameras, or radar, or aircraft to misidentify. Ancient Roman texts describe what writers of the time called phantom ships, luminous objects seen drifting through clouds, observed by multiple witnesses, recorded by historians who had no framework for what they were seeing, and simply described what was there. Medieval European manuscripts, some of them beautifully illustrated, contain images that certain modern researchers point to as depictions of disc-shaped or cylindrical objects hovering over towns and landscapes. A woodcut from Basel, Switzerland, dated 1566, shows a sky full of dark spheres engaged in what the original text described as a battle overhead. A broadsheet from Nuremberg in 1561 describes a similar event, dozens of objects, various shapes, witnessed by the townspeople in the early morning sky. We should be careful with these records. They are filtered through the language, the cosmology, and the illustrative conventions of their time. A medieval artist depicting something unusual in the sky would naturally reach for the visual vocabulary available to them. What they drew may not be what we would draw. What they meant may not map cleanly onto what a modern researcher reads into it. But the impulse these records reflect, the impulse to look up, to notice something that does not fit, and to write it down, that impulse is ancient. It is deeply human, and it suggests that the sky has always offered more questions than answers to the people living beneath it. The modern era begins. The modern UFO era, however, is generally considered to have begun on a specific date, June 24th, 1947. On that afternoon, a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold was flying his small plane near Mount Rainier in Washington state. He was searching, as it happened, for a military transport aircraft that had reportedly gone down in the mountains, a routine search mission on a clear day. What he saw instead was anything but routine. 9 objects, flying in a loose formation, moving at a speed he estimated at around 1,200 miles per hour. This was 1947. The sound barrier had not yet been officially broken. That would happen a few months later, in October, when Chuck Yeager made history in the Bell X-1. The fastest aircraft of the day could not come close to the speed Arnold described. And these objects, whatever they were, had no visible wings, no tail, no exhaust. They moved, he said, the way a saucer would move if you skipped it across the surface of water, a skipping, undulating motion unlike any aircraft he had ever seen. Arnold reported his sighting to authorities when he landed. A reporter covering the story picked up on his description of the object's movement. The phrase flying saucers was born. Not from Arnold himself, he had described how they moved, not what they looked like, but from the imagination of a journalist who found the image irresistible. Within weeks, sightings were being reported across the United States. Within months, they were coming in from around the world. Newspapers ran front-page headlines. Radio programs discussed the phenomenon. The public was simultaneously thrilled and unsettled. And the US military, watching all of this unfold, began asking a very practical question. If these objects are real, and if they are not ours, whose are they? That question, whose are they, set the tone for everything that followed. It framed the phenomenon in terms of technology and threat, rather than mystery and wonder. It sent investigators looking for answers in directions that may, some researchers have since argued, have caused them to miss the stranger and more interesting possibilities. But it also meant that from very early on, serious people with serious resources were paying attention. A conversation that has never fully stopped began in earnest that summer. Governments listened, researchers gathered, witnesses came forward, and the sky, indifferent as ever to the noise being made beneath it, continued to offer its occasional, unexplained lights. That is where the modern story begins. In the summer of 1947, with a pilot, a formation of unidentified objects, and a world that was just beginning to ask what, exactly, it had been sharing its sky with all along. The government gets involved. The US military's initial response to the wave of sightings was practical, almost businesslike. They were not, at first, asking whether these objects were extraterrestrial. They were asking whether they were Soviet. The Cold War was young and deeply tense in 1947. The United States and the Soviet Union were already watching each other with the careful, nervous attention of two powers, who understood that the next war might be unlike anything that had come before. The idea of unidentified aircraft moving freely over American soil, aircraft that no one could identify, that performed in ways no known aircraft could, was a national security concern regardless of their origin. If the Soviets had developed some extraordinary new technology, that was something the military needed to know about immediately. So in 1947, the Air Force established Project Sign. It was classified. Its mandate was to collect, investigate, and evaluate reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. The people assigned to it were not fringe thinkers. They were military analysts doing what military analysts do, gathering data, looking for patterns, trying to determine whether a threat existed. Project Sign produced an internal document, reportedly. That leaned toward the extraterrestrial hypothesis as a possible explanation for some of the cases. That document was said to have been rejected and destroyed by higher command. What replaced it was Project Grudge, a program whose name, some researchers have noted, seemed to reflect its disposition toward the subject. Grudge was widely seen, even at the time, as more interested in explaining sightings away than in investigating them rigorously. Then came Project Blue Book. Running from 1952 to 1969, Blue Book was the longest and most publicly visible of the Air Force's UFO investigation programs. It investigated more than 12,000 reported sightings over 17 years. The vast majority of those sightings were explained: misidentified aircraft, weather balloons, atmospheric effects, planets seen under unusual conditions, high-altitude research balloons, and in some cases, outright hoaxes. The investigators were thorough about these explanations, and in most cases, the explanations were reasonable, but approximately 700 cases were not explained. After full investigation, they were classified simply as unidentified, not extraterrestrial, not hoaxes, just unknown. In 1969, the Air Force closed Blue Book. A report commissioned from the University of Colorado, known as the Condon Report, after its director Edward Condon, concluded that further study of UFOs was unlikely to yield scientific value. The Air Force accepted this conclusion. UFOs, officially, were no longer worth investigating. Many researchers disputed that conclusion at the time. They pointed to the 700 unexplained cases sitting quietly in the files. They pointed to evidence that some investigations had been steered toward predetermined conclusions. They pointed to the gap between what the documents said and what the witnesses had seen. Many still dispute it today. Why people started questioning the skepticism toward official conclusions did not come from nowhere. It did not spring up overnight, fully formed, in the minds of people looking for something to distrust. It grew slowly, and it grew from specific experiences. From specific moments where the official story and the lived experience of witnesses did not line up. Witnesses reported being discouraged from speaking publicly. Not always dramatically, sometimes it was quiet. A conversation after a debriefing. A suggestion that it would be better not to discuss what had been seen. A form to sign. Some military personnel who had filed UFO reports said they were pressured, directly or indirectly, to revise their accounts, to soften the details, to frame what they had seen in ways that fit more easily into acceptable categories. For the people this happened to, the message was clear enough: this is not something we want discussed. And then there were the explanations themselves. In several high-profile cases, the official explanation offered for a sighting simply did not match what the people who had been there remembered seeing. Weather balloons were invoked frequently, atmospheric inversions, misidentified planets. Some of these explanations were entirely plausible, some of them to the witnesses. Felt like they had been chosen for their convenience rather than their accuracy. When you have seen something with your own eyes, and someone hands you an explanation that does not fit the shape of what you saw, you notice. There was also the broader world these events were happening inside. The 1940s and 50s were not naive decades. They were years in which trust between citizens and institutions had already been tested in significant ways. People had seen governments make decisions they were not told about. They had learned, sometimes painfully, that official statements were not always complete. The inclination to take government explanations at face value was not universal. For many people, a healthy skepticism was simply the rational response to the world as they had experienced it. Then came the Freedom of Information Act in 1966, and with it, eventually, the release of thousands of pages of government documents related to UFO investigations. What those documents revealed was not, in most cases, smoking gun evidence of extraterrestrial contact. There were no photographs of recovered craft, no confirmed descriptions of alien beings, but there was something else, something quieter, and in its own way more unsettling. The documents revealed that the government had taken this subject considerably more seriously, internally, than its public statements had ever suggested. Programs that were never publicly acknowledged. Internal memos expressing genuine uncertainty. Communications between officials that reflected not the breezy dismissal offered to journalists and the public, but real, unresolved concern about what was being reported. That gap between what was said publicly and what was written privately became the foundation of modern UFO research. Not a single dramatic revelation. Just the steady accumulation of evidence that the official version had always been incomplete. And once people saw that gap, it was difficult to unsee it. The key figures over the decades, a number of people have shaped how we think about this subject. Not just what we believe about UFOs, but how we talk about them, how we investigate them, what questions we think are worth asking. J. Allen Hynek is perhaps the most important figure in the serious study of this phenomenon. He began his career as a skeptic, genuinely, not performatively. He was an astronomer, a credentialed scientist, and when the Air Force hired him as a consultant for Project Blue Book, his job was essentially to provide scientific cover for dismissing sightings. To look at the reports coming in and explain them away with the authority of an expert. For a while he did exactly that. He was the one who suggested that witnesses in a famous 1951 case had simply seen the planet Jupiter. He coined the phrase swamp gas to explain a series of sightings in Michigan in 1966, a phrase that was so inadequate to what witnesses described that it caused a minor public outcry and arguably did more damage to the Air Force's credibility than the sightings themselves. But Hynek was also honest, and over years of reviewing cases, he found a subset of reports that he could not explain. Not because the witnesses seemed unreliable, but because the accounts were too detailed, too consistent, and too resistant to conventional explanation. His position shifted, slowly, carefully, the way a scientist's position shifts, following the evidence rather than the conclusion he had started with. He developed the close encounter classification system. Close encounters of the first kind, a sighting at close range. The second kind, physical evidence left behind. The third kind, contact with beings. This framework, calm and methodical, gave researchers a shared language. It is still used today. Steven Spielberg borrowed the third category for the title of his 1977 film, a film that Hynek himself consulted on and briefly appeared in. By the end of his life, Hynek believed that the UFO phenomenon was real, was unexplained, and deserved serious scientific attention. He founded the Center for UFO Studies to provide exactly that. Stanton Friedman came from a different direction. A nuclear physicist by training, he spent decades as the most rigorous and persistent investigator of the Roswell case specifically, and the extraterrestrial hypothesis generally. He tracked down witnesses. He reviewed documents. He argued carefully and at length that the evidence pointed toward a conclusion the mainstream was not willing to accept. Luis Elizondo represents the most recent chapter. A former military intelligence official with a verified career in national security, he ran the Pentagon's ATIP program for years before resigning and going public. His decision to speak openly, to say in plain terms that what the program had documented was not adequately being addressed, brought the conversation into congressional chambers and front-page headlines in a way it had not been before. And then there are the witnesses, the pilots, the radar operators, the people who were simply outside one evening and saw something they have never been able to fully explain. They are not footnotes. They are the reason any of this conversation exists at all. Their uncertainty is real. And it is still with us, the famous theories. These are the stories most people have heard, at least in passing. The names, the places, the claims that have become part of the cultural conversation around UFOs. We will take our time with each one. The Roswell incident, the claim, stated plainly, is this: In the summer of 1947, an alien spacecraft crashed in the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. The US military recovered the wreckage and possibly the bodies of its crew, and covered up the entire event. That is the claim. We will walk through it carefully. The Roswell story begins not with a crash, but with a rancher. His name was Mac Brazel, and he worked a sheep ranch about 75 miles north of Roswell. In late June or early July of 1947, the exact date is uncertain, Brazel rode out across his property after a night of unusually loud thunderstorms and found something he had not expected. Debris, a large field of it, scattered across nearly 3/4 of a mile of his land. What he found was strange enough that he gathered some of it and kept it. Metallic foil that was extraordinarily thin and light, but which seemed to spring back to its original shape when crumpled. Material that witnesses later described as impossible to cut, impossible to burn, and almost weightless in the hand. There were sticks, rubber, something like thread, and, reportedly, markings on some of the material that looked almost like symbols or writing, though nothing anyone could read. Brazel reported his discovery to the local sheriff, George Wilcox. The sheriff contacted Roswell Army Airfield, and on July 8, 1947, the base's public information officer issued a press release that would echo through the following decades. The Army, it said, had recovered a flying disc. The story went around the world within hours. Newspapers ran it on their front pages. Radio programs picked it up. For one brief moment, the United States military had officially, publicly stated that a flying disc had been recovered. Then, within 24 hours, the statement was retracted. Brigadier General Roger Ramey held a press conference in Fort Worth, Texas. The debris displayed for photographers was identified as the remains of a weather balloon and its radar reflector. The reporters who had gathered expecting something extraordinary were shown a tangle of foil and sticks on a floor. The story was over, officially, before it had properly begun. And for about 30 years, it stayed that way. Roswell faded. The world moved on to other concerns. The incident became, at most, a footnote. Then, the researchers arrived. In the late 1970s, writers Stanton Friedman and William Moore began tracking down the people who had been present during the original events. Many of them were now elderly. Some were willing to talk. And what they said did not match the weather balloon explanation. Former military personnel described being ordered to collect debris and transport it under armed guard. A level of security that seemed disproportionate for a downed weather balloon. Some described material with properties unlike anything they had encountered before or since. Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who had originally retrieved the debris from Brazel's ranch, told researchers that what he had seen was nothing like a weather balloon. He had handled weather balloons before. He knew what they looked like. Some witnesses went further. They described not just unusual debris, but bodies. Small bodies recovered from a secondary site some distance from the main debris field. The details varied between accounts, the number of bodies, their condition, the exact location, but the consistency of the basic claim, across multiple witnesses who had reportedly not been in contact with each other, was striking to the researchers collecting the testimony. Mortician Glenn Dennis added one of the most vivid details. Dennis worked at a funeral home in Roswell that had a contract with the Air Force Base. He claimed that in early July of 1947, he received calls from the base asking about the availability of small hermetically sealed caskets and about preservation techniques for bodies that had been exposed to the elements. Later, he said, a nurse he knew from the base, a woman he identified only by a pseudonym, as he claimed she had been transferred and he had lost contact with her, described to him what she had witnessed during autopsies performed on non-human bodies. Dennis's account has been disputed. The nurse he described could not be identified or located. Some researchers concluded that parts of his story did not hold up under scrutiny. The official explanation shifted again in the 1990s. A government report published in 1994 attributed the debris to Project Mogul, a classified program that used high-altitude balloon arrays to monitor Soviet nuclear tests. The unusual material properties some witnesses described were consistent, the report argued, with the specialized materials used in those balloons. A follow-up report in 1997 addressed the body accounts, suggesting that witnesses had conflated the Roswell events with memories of Air Force crash test dummies used in experiments conducted in the early 1950s, and that over the passage of decades, the memories had merged. The researchers who had spent years on the case were unconvinced. They pointed out that the crash test dummy program began in 1954, years after the events witnesses were describing. They noted that multiple explanations had now been offered for the same event, which did not inspire confidence in any of them. And they pointed to the internal consistency of the original witness accounts, many of which had been given long before any alternative explanation had been proposed. Accounts that would have had to be fabricated or confused in remarkably similar ways for the official explanation to hold. What resonated about Roswell, what has kept it alive for nearly 80 years, was not just the claim itself. It was the emotional and logical structure underneath it. The official story had already changed once, very publicly, very quickly. Whatever actually happened in that desert, the US military had initially called it a flying disc, and then, within a day, decided it was a weather balloon. That single fact, that retraction, lodged in the public mind like a splinter. If they changed the story once, people reasoned, they could change it again. Roswell became the symbolic center of everything the UFO phenomenon represents. The name alone carries weight that no other case quite matches. It is shorthand for the whole question, the question of what the government knows, what it has chosen not to share, and what might be sitting in a classified facility somewhere, quietly waiting. Whatever happened in that New Mexico desert in the summer of 1947, the questions it left behind have never been fully put to rest. And that was just the beginning of what people started to question. Area 51, the claim here is layered. At its simplest, it goes like this. Area 51, a classified US Air Force facility sitting in the middle of the Nevada desert, is where the government stores and studies recovered alien spacecraft, and possibly, in some versions of the story, living extraterrestrial beings. That is the claim at its core. But the story around it is considerably more textured than that single sentence suggests. Area 51 is real. That much is not in dispute. The facility has existed since the 1950s. Carved out of the desert at a dry lake bed called Groom Lake, roughly 83 miles northwest of Las Vegas. It was developed initially as a testing ground for some of the most sensitive aircraft programs of the Cold War era. The U-2 spy plane was tested there, an aircraft that could fly at altitudes previously considered unreachable, and whose existence was itself classified for years. The SR-71 Blackbird, still one of the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built, was developed and tested in the same remote, carefully guarded airspace. The secrecy surrounding the facility was, in practical terms, entirely explainable. These were among the most valuable technological secrets the United States possessed during a period of intense superpower competition. The last thing the Air Force wanted was Soviet intelligence learning the capabilities of aircraft that gave America a significant strategic advantage. So the base was hidden. The airspace above it was restricted. Workers were flown in on unmarked aircraft. And officially, for decades, the facility did not exist. The US government neither confirmed nor denied that Area 51 was there at all. This was not a subtle non-denial. It was an active, sustained policy of official silence. When civilians reported seeing unusual lights and aircraft in the skies above the Nevada desert, and they did, regularly, because classified aircraft performing test flights at extreme speeds and altitudes look very much like what people describe as UFOs, the government said nothing. It could not explain the sightings without revealing what it was testing. so it left the questions hanging. The CIA formally acknowledged the facility's existence only in 2013, in a declassified history released in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. For anyone who had been watching the UFO conversation unfold over the preceding decades, this acknowledgement was something of a quiet vindication, not of the alien theories, but of the basic claim that the government had been less than forthcoming about what was happening in that stretch of Nevada desert. Into this vacuum of official silence stepped Bob Lazar. In 1989, a Las Vegas television reporter named George Knapp aired an interview with a man whose face was obscured and who was identified only as Dennis. He later came forward under his real name. Bob Lazar claimed to have worked as a physicist at a facility he called S4, a site he described as located a short distance south of the main Area 51 complex. Built into the side of a mountain range, its hangar doors angled to blend with the hillside. What Lazar described inside those hangars was extraordinary. 9-disc shaped craft, he said, of clearly non-human origin. His job, as he explained it, was not to study the craft as a whole, but to help understand and reverse engineer their propulsion systems. He described the propulsion as operating on principles entirely outside conventional physics, a gravity wave generator powered by a stable isotope of an element he called element 115, which at the time of his interview did not appear on the periodic table. That detail became one of the most discussed aspects of his account. In 2003, scientists synthesized element 115 in a laboratory. It was officially named Moscovium in 2016. Lazar's supporters pointed to this as a remarkable piece of corroboration. How would he have known in 1989 to describe a propulsion system built around an element that did not yet officially exist? His critics offered a more measured response. The existence of element 115 had been theoretically predicted by nuclear physicists for years before its synthesis, and anyone with a serious physics background would have been aware of it. Which brought the conversation to Lazar's background. He claimed to hold advanced degrees from MIT and Caltech. Neither institution could confirm his enrollment. The government denied any record of his employment at any facility near Area 51. His supporters noted, with some logic, that this was precisely what a cover-up would look like, that erasing someone's records was well within the capability of an intelligence apparatus that wanted to discredit a whistleblower. His critics argued that the simpler explanation was that the records did not exist because the credentials did not exist. What made Lazar's story linger, what kept it alive through decades of scrutiny, was not any single verifiable claim. It was the texture of the account. He did not speak the way most people speak when they are fabricating something. He was technical. He was specific. He described not just the craft, but the bureaucratic structure around the program, the security protocols, the layout of the facility, the way workers were transported and compartmentalized. The internal consistency of his account was difficult to dismiss, even for people who found his claims implausible. Whether Bob Lazar worked at S4 and saw what he described, or whether his account was an elaborate fabrication, a sincere delusion, or something in between, is a question that has not been definitively answered. He has maintained his story consistently for nearly 4 decades. A documentary filmed in 2018 found a document that appeared to confirm at least one element of his claimed employment history. The question remains open. Area 51 itself has since become something far larger than any single story. It is a cultural institution. A shorthand. The 2019 Storm Area 51 event, which began as a Facebook joke suggesting that millions of people rush the gates simultaneously, drew thousands of people to the Nevada desert in a spirit that was mostly absurdist and celebratory, but carried underneath it a genuine current of curiosity, of wanting to know. The facility remains operational. the airspace remains restricted. And whatever is inside those buildings, whether it is the next generation of classified aircraft or something recovered from somewhere else entirely, the story of what people have imagined it to contain says something quietly true about the human relationship with secrecy. We do not like not knowing, and we will build entire mythologies in the space that silence leaves behind. The Phoenix Lights on the evening of March 13th, 1997, thousands of people across the state of Arizona and into Nevada and the Mexican state of Sonora reported seeing something in the sky that they could not explain. This was not a fleeting moment. It was not a single witness standing alone in a field, uncertain of what they had seen. It unfolded over several hours, across hundreds of miles, observed by an extraordinary number of people going about their ordinary evening lives. People on their way home from work, families in their backyards, drivers who pulled over on the highway because what was above them was too strange to ignore while moving. The event is now known as the Phoenix Lights, and it remains, by almost any measure, one of the most widely witnessed and least conclusively explained UFO events in recorded history. The sightings began in the early evening, around 8 o'clock, in the Henderson area of Nevada. A man described a V-shaped formation of lights passing overhead, moving southward, over the following hours. Similar reports came in along a corridor stretching from the Nevada border down through the length of Arizona, through Prescott, through the outskirts of Phoenix, through Tucson, and across the border into Sonora, Mexico. The geography of the sightings traced a clear path, as though whatever was being seen was moving steadily and slowly in a single direction. What witnesses described, again and again, was not a loose cluster of lights. It was something structured, something large, a massive V-shaped or triangular craft. Estimates of its size ranged from the length of several football fields to, in some accounts, something closer to a mile across, outlined by a series of lights along its leading edges, moving at a pace that some witnesses described as almost stately, unhurried, as though it had no concern about being seen. And it was silent. That detail appears consistently across accounts. Whatever this object was, it produced no sound, no engine noise, no roar, no vibration that witnesses could feel. It simply moved through the sky above a major American city, in full view of thousands of people, and made no sound at all. Several witnesses described something that went beyond the lights themselves. They described a solid shape, a craft that, as it passed overhead, blocked out the stars behind it. This is an important detail, because it distinguishes their experience from simply seeing a formation of lights in the sky. A formation of lights, military flares for instance, or aircraft flying in close proximity, would not block out the stars. A solid physical object would, and a number of witnesses were specific and consistent about this. They saw a shape that occluded the sky. Something was there, something with mass and dimension. The Arizona governor at the time was Fife Symington. He was a former Air Force officer, a man with a background that made him neither naive about aircraft nor prone to dramatic conclusions about unusual sightings. In the days after the event, as the story spread and public concern grew, Symington held a press conference. He announced that his office had found the responsible party. An aide was then brought forward wearing a grey alien costume, to laughter from the assembled press. The implication was clear. The governor was treating the sightings as something between a curiosity and an absurdity. It was a deflection that many witnesses found deeply dismissive. They had seen something. They knew what they had seen. And the spectacle of a rubber alien mask was not an explanation. Years later, Symington reversed his position completely. In 2007, a decade after the event, he gave an interview in which he stated plainly that he had seen the object himself on the night of March 13th, that he had been outside and watched it pass overhead, that it was unlike any aircraft he had ever encountered in his years of Air Force experience. He described it as enormous, silent, and structured. Not a formation of lights, but a craft. He said he had made light of it publicly because he had not wanted to cause panic, and because he did not know what to say. But he was clear that the mockery had not reflected what he actually knew. A sitting governor with military aviation experience stating under his own name that he had witnessed something he could not explain. That is not a footnote. That is a significant piece of testimony. The official explanation, when it came, attributed the lights to military flares. The Maryland Air National Guard had been conducting training exercises in the area that evening, dropping illumination flares over the Barry Goldwater Range south of Phoenix. Video footage captured by residents showed a line of bright, slowly descending lights, and this footage, the Air Force suggested, was what people had seen and misinterpreted. Some witnesses accepted this explanation. The timing was consistent. The appearance of slowly descending bright lights could, under certain conditions, resemble what was described, but many witnesses were not satisfied, particularly those who had seen the object, the structured, silent, star-occluding craft, earlier in the evening, before any flares would have been dropped. These witnesses were describing something different from slowly descending lights. They were describing a vehicle, and the flare explanation, however plausible for some of the footage captured later that night, did not address the earlier reports. What the Phoenix Lights case leaves behind is a question that has never been cleanly resolved. Not because the witnesses were unreliable, not because the evidence was thin, but because the volume and consistency of the testimony, combined with the inadequacy of the official explanation for all of it, creates a gap that simple answers do not fill. Thousands of people looked up on the same evening. They saw the same thing. A governor saw it too, and said so a decade later, when he no longer needed to manage the politics of it. Whatever passed over Arizona on the night of March 13th, 1997, it has not been explained to the satisfaction of the people who were there, and their accounts have not gone away. The Tic Tac incident in November of 2004, pilots from the US-Nimitz carrier strike group were operating off the coast of Southern California when they encountered something that none of them have ever been able to fully explain. It is worth taking a moment to understand what the US-Nimitz strike group was. This was not a small operation. It was one of the most sophisticated naval deployments in the world, a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier surrounded by escort vessels, staffed by thousands of highly trained personnel, equipped with some of the most advanced radar, sonar, and sensor technology available to any military in the world. These were not people likely to be confused by something ordinary. The encounter did not begin on the day of the visual sighting. It began days earlier, with the radar operators. The US Princeton, a guided missile cruiser operating as part of the strike group, had been tracking anomalous contacts for approximately 2 weeks before the famous intercept. The contacts appeared at very high altitude, above 80,000 feet, and then dropped with extraordinary speed to low altitude, sometimes hovering near the ocean surface, before disappearing from the radar entirely. They showed no flight path consistent with any known aircraft. They did not squawk a transponder signal. They simply appeared, moved in ways that radar operators found deeply puzzling, and vanished. Senior Chief Operations Specialist Kevin Day was one of the radar operators tracking these contacts. He later described his confusion and growing concern during those 2 weeks. He was seeing things on his equipment that should not have been there, objects performing maneuvers that his training and experience told him were not possible. He reported the contacts up the chain of command. Eventually, a decision was made to send aircraft to investigate. Commander David Fravor was chosen for the intercept. He was, by any measure, an exceptional choice, a graduate of the Navy's elite Top Gun program, with more than 16 years of flying experience at that point. He understood aircraft. He understood what was possible and what was not. He was, in the language of aviation, a very hard person to impress. Fravor and his wingman, Lieutenant Commander Jim Slate, were flying FA-18F Super Hornets when they were directed toward the contact. What they found when they arrived at the location was, first, a disturbance in the ocean surface below, an area of churning white water in an otherwise calm sea, roughly the size of a 737 aircraft, as though something large was just beneath the surface or had recently been there. And above that disturbance, hovering, was the object. Fravor described it later in terms that have become among the most quoted in modern UFO discussion. It was white, oval, approximately 40 feet in length. It had no wings, no tail, no visible means of propulsion, no exhaust. It looked, he said, like a giant tic-tac breath mint. It was moving, not erratically, but with a kind of fluid, unhurried motion, hovering above the disturbed water below it. Fravor began a descending spiral toward the object, attempting to get closer and observe it more clearly. The object responded. As he descended, it began to mirror his movement, ascending toward him. The two were closing on each other. And then, in an instant that Fravor has described as unlike anything in his aviation experience, the object accelerated. Not gradually, not with the kind of increasing thrust you see from even the most powerful jet engines. It simply went. It covered what Fravor estimated as roughly 60 miles in a matter of seconds, disappearing entirely from visual range and reappearing almost simultaneously on the radar at a pre-briefed rendezvous point called the Cap Point, a location that Fravor and his wingman had been discussing over their radio just before the intercept. That last detail is one of the most unsettling aspects of the account. The object appeared to have gone, in seconds, to a location that the pilots had mentioned as their planned destination. Whether that was coincidence or something else, Fravor does not claim to know. A second section of aircraft arrived shortly after Fravor's encounter. One of those aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Chad Underwood, carried an advanced infrared targeting pod. Underwood was able to lock onto the object and capture footage. Several minutes of infrared video showing a small, white, oblong shape moving against a dark background. The targeting system struggling to maintain its lock as the object accelerated and maneuvered. That footage sat in classified files for 13 years. In 2017, it was released publicly, first through the To the Stars Academy, a research organization co-founded by Luis Elizondo, and later confirmed as authentic by the Pentagon itself. The US Department of Defense stated officially that the footage was real, that it had been captured by Navy personnel, and that the objects in it remained unidentified. That confirmation matters. This was not a grainy photograph taken by an anonymous civilian. It was authenticated infrared footage captured by military sensor equipment, released with the acknowledgement of the United States government that it did not know what was in it. Fravor has been careful, consistently, about what he claims. He does not say the object was extraterrestrial. He does not claim to know its origin. What he says is precise and considered. In over 16 years of naval aviation, he had never seen anything that moved the way that object moved. That the acceleration and maneuverability it demonstrated exceeded, by a significant margin, anything in known human aerospace capability. That whatever it was real, it was physical, and it was not something he could explain. The official position of the US government, as of the years following the footage's release, has been essentially this: we do not know what it was. That statement, quiet, careful, and remarkable, marked something genuinely new in the public conversation about this subject. Not a dismissal. Not a weather balloon. Not a swamp gas explanation offered with a straight face. Just an acknowledgement from the Pentagon itself that something had been seen that could not be identified. For a subject that had spent decades being officially ignored, that admission was not nothing. It was, in fact, a great deal. The deep and fringe theories. Now we go a little further. These theories are less mainstream. Some of them are held by a relatively small number of people. Some are extensions of the theories we have already covered, taken several steps further. Some stand entirely on their own. All of them have believers who have thought carefully about them. The disclosure movement, the final theory in this first tier, is different from the others we have covered. It is not about a single night, or a single location, or a single witness standing in a field trying to describe something they saw overhead. It is about something broader and more sustained. A claim that stretches across decades, across administrations, across the careers of dozens of people who worked inside the institutions they are now describing. The claim, stated plainly, is this: governments around the world, and particularly the United States, know far more about UFOs and extraterrestrial contact than they have ever told the public. And a small, carefully maintained infrastructure of secrecy has been keeping that information contained since at least the 1940s. This is what researchers call the disclosure narrative, and the people who advocate for it most seriously are not, as a rule, people speaking from the margins. They are former military officers, former intelligence officials, congressional representatives who have sat on oversight committees and seen classified briefings, investigative journalists with decades of experience cultivating sources inside the national security apparatus. These are people with careers and reputations that they are, in many cases, placing at considerable risk by speaking publicly. That does not make them right, but it makes them worth listening to carefully. The disclosure narrative holds that the truth about UFOs, whatever that truth is, has been known at the highest levels of government for a very long time. That the recovery of craft and possibly biological material began in the late 1940s. That a compartmentalized program operating outside normal congressional oversight was established to study and manage this material. And that over the following decades, as administrations changed and personnel turned over, this program became so deeply classified, so thoroughly compartmentalized, that even presidents and senior officials may not have had full access to it. This last point, the idea that a secret program could operate largely outside the awareness of elected leadership, is one that skeptics find difficult to accept. Surely, the argument goes, someone would have told the president. Surely Congress would have known. Surely a secret this large could not have been kept this long. But people who have worked inside the classification system push back on this intuition. They point out that compartmentalization, the practice of dividing sensitive programs into isolated cells where no individual has the full picture, is a standard feature of intelligence work, not an exceptional one. They point out that programs exist at classification levels that routine presidential briefings do not reach. And they point out that the history of American intelligence contains several examples of programs that operated for years or decades without congressional knowledge or oversight. Programs that were eventually revealed not because the system worked as intended, but because someone decided to talk. The modern chapter of the disclosure story began in earnest in 2017. On December 16th of that year, the New York Times published a front-page article revealing the existence of a Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, ATIP. The program had operated from 2007 to 2012, funded with $22 million quietly allocated through the defense budget at the request of Senator Harry Reid of Nevada. Its purpose was to investigate unidentified aerial phenomena encountered by military personnel. This was not a report in a fringe publication. It was the New York Times, with bylines from serious investigative journalists based on sources within the government. The same article included the release of the Tic Tac footage, and it introduced the public to Luis Elizondo, the former military intelligence official who had run ATIP and who had resigned, he said, because he felt the program's findings were not being taken seriously by leadership. The article opened a door that has not closed since. Congressional interest in the subject grew steadily in the years that followed. Hearings were held. Legislation was passed requiring the intelligence community to report on unidentified aerial phenomena. The UAP task force was established. Then the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. The language shifted from UFO, with all its cultural baggage, to UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, a deliberate reframing intended to signal that the subject was being treated with seriousness rather than embarrassment. And then came David Grush. In July of 2023, Grush, a former Air Force intelligence officer and National Geospatial Intelligence Agency official with a verified and decorated career, testified before the House Oversight Committee, under oath, in a congressional chamber, before the cameras of every major news network. He stated that the US government was in possession of non-human craft. That biological material of non-human origin had been recovered. That he had learned of these programs through official channels during his work as a OAP investigator for the intelligence community, and that individuals with direct knowledge of these programs had faced retaliation for attempting to bring this information forward through legitimate whistleblower channels. Grush did not present physical evidence in that hearing. He described what he had been told, what he had reviewed, and what he believed to be true based on his access and his sources. His claims were extraordinary. His credentials were not in question. His willingness to make these statements under oath, where lying to Congress carries legal consequences, was noted by observers across the political spectrum. Whether Grush's claims are accurate, partially accurate, or the product of sincere but mistaken belief is genuinely unknown. The classified evidence he described has not been made public. The programs he referenced have not been confirmed. The story is unresolved. But something has shifted. These conversations are happening in congressional chambers now. In front-page newspaper articles, in Pentagon press releases that use the words, "we do not know." The subject that was dismissed for decades with weather balloons and rubber alien costumes is being discussed seriously and publicly by people with security clearances and sworn testimony and careers built on credibility. The disclosure movement, at its deepest level, is not really about alien spacecraft. It is about trust, about the relationship between a government and the people it is meant to serve, about the question of whether there are things being kept from the public that the public has a right to know. Whatever the ultimate answer turns out to be, that question is a legitimate one, and it is not going away. The ancient astronaut theory this is one of the oldest and most widely discussed fringe theories connected to UFO belief. The claim is simple to state, but expansive in its implications, that extraterrestrial beings visited Earth in the distant past, made contact with early human civilizations, and were interpreted by those civilizations as gods. It is a theory that sits at the intersection of archaeology, mythology, and imagination. It asks us to look backward, not forward, not to the skies of the present, but to the stories and structures left behind by people who lived thousands of years ago. Proponents of the theory point first to ancient monuments. The pyramids of Egypt are perhaps the most frequently cited example. Massive, geometrically precise structures built with millions of stone blocks, some weighing several tons, aligned with remarkable accuracy to the cardinal directions. The Great Pyramid of Giza, in particular, is often described as being aligned to true north with an error of only a fraction of a degree, a level of precision that feels, at first glance, almost modern. The question that follows is a natural one: how? How did a civilization working with what we understand to be relatively simple tools, copper chisels, wooden sleds, human labor, achieve this level of precision and scale? How were the stones quarried, transported, and placed with such consistency? The mainstream archaeological answers to these questions exist, and they are detailed. They involve large, organized labor forces, clever engineering techniques, ramps, levers, and a deep practical understanding of geometry and astronomy. But for some, those explanations feel incomplete, or at least unsatisfying, and into that space of uncertainty, the ancient astronaut theory offers an alternative, that the knowledge required to build such structures did not originate entirely on Earth. The Nazca lines in Peru are another example frequently brought into the conversation. These are enormous geoglyphs etched into the desert floor, long, straight lines, geometric patterns, and stylized figures of animals, some stretching hundreds of meters across the landscape. From ground level, many of them are difficult to fully perceive. From above, their shapes become clear. This has led some proponents of the theory to ask a simple question: if these figures are best seen from the air, who were they meant for? The conventional explanation is that they had ritual or ceremonial significance, and that their creators may have used simple surveying techniques and elevated vantage points to plan them. But the image of vast designs visible only from the sky has proven compelling, and it has been folded into the broader narrative of ancient contact. Then there are the texts. Ancient Sumerian writings describe beings called the Anunnaki, figures who descended from the heavens and interacted with humanity. Interpretations of these texts vary widely. Mainstream scholarship tends to read them within the context of mythological storytelling, symbolic language, and religious belief. Ancient astronaut proponents sometimes read them more literally, suggesting that these gods were, in fact, visitors from elsewhere. In ancient Indian texts, particularly certain interpretations of the Vedas and later epics like the Mahabharata, there are descriptions of flying vehicles called vimanas. These are described, in some translations, as machines capable of traveling through the sky, sometimes with detailed features that, to modern readers, can sound almost technological. Again, historians and linguists generally interpret these passages symbolically or poetically, but for those inclined toward the ancient astronaut framework, they read as something more concrete. The modern popularity of this theory can be traced largely to a single book. In 1968, Erich von Däniken published Chariots of the Gods. It became an international bestseller, translated into dozens of languages, selling tens of millions of copies worldwide. The book presented a sweeping argument that many of the great achievements of ancient civilizations could not be fully explained by the capabilities we attribute to those civilizations, and that extraterrestrial intervention provided the missing piece. It was a compelling narrative. It took real mysteries, real gaps in understanding, and offered a unifying explanation that was both simple and expansive. It invited readers to look at familiar historical sites and see them differently, to reinterpret myth as memory, to imagine that what ancient people called gods were, in fact, visitors. Archaeologists and historians have been consistently critical of this framework, and not without reason. One of the central concerns is that it tends to underestimate the ingenuity and capability of ancient human societies. Over the past century, archaeological research has uncovered increasingly detailed evidence of how these civilizations worked, how they organized labor, how they developed tools, how they understood mathematics and astronomy. The picture that emerges is not one of primitive people incapable of complex thought, but of highly sophisticated cultures solving difficult problems with the resources available to them. There is also the issue of selective interpretation. Ancient texts are often translated, retranslated, and interpreted through modern lenses. Passages that sound technological in one translation may carry entirely different connotations in another. Symbols can be mistaken for literal descriptions. Context can be lost. And, as some critics have pointed out, there is an uncomfortable pattern in how the theory has sometimes been applied. A tendency to suggest that certain non-Western civilizations could not have achieved what they achieved without outside help. That implication, whether intended or not, raises important questions about how we assign credit and capability across cultures. And yet, even when we set the extraterrestrial explanation aside, what remains is still remarkable. The Great Pyramid is real. Its precision is real. The Nazca lines are real, stretching across the desert in shapes that have endured for centuries. The ancient texts are real, filled with imagery that continues to provoke interpretation and debate. We do not need to invoke alien intervention to find these things extraordinary, but we do need to allow ourselves to feel that they are. Perhaps that is part of the enduring appeal of the ancient astronaut theory. Not necessarily the conclusion it reaches, but the sense of wonder it begins with. The recognition that the ancient world was not simple, that the people who lived in it were not simple, that they looked at the sky as we do and tried to make sense of it with the tools and language they had. Whether their stories describe gods, metaphors, or something else entirely, they remind us of something quiet and continuous, that human beings have always been looking upward and wondering whether we are alone. And that question, like the monuments themselves, has endured. The hollow earth and underground bases theory this is where things begin to feel a little more distant from the familiar. Up to this point, most of the theories we have explored have taken place in the sky, objects seen above us, lights moving across open space, encounters happening in air that, at least in principle, we understand. This theory shifts the direction entirely. Not upward, but downward. The hollow earth theory, in its modern UFO connected form, suggests that the interior of our planet is not entirely what we have been taught. Instead of a solid mantle surrounding a molten core, it proposes that there are vast cavities beneath the surface, enormous hidden spaces that may contain entire ecosystems. In some versions of the theory, these spaces are inhabited by unknown forms of life. In others, they are home to advanced civilizations, either remnants of ancient human societies or something not human at all. And in its most elaborate form, the theory connects directly to UFOs. It suggests that some of the objects seen in the sky are not arriving from distant stars, but emerging from beneath our feet, that there are bases deep underground, under mountains, beneath the ocean floor, possibly near the polar regions, where non-human intelligence operates, largely unseen. It is a dramatic shift in perspective. The unknown is no longer far away. It is close, hidden, rather than distant. The connection to UFO sightings comes primarily through a specific category of reports. Over the decades, a number of witnesses, including trained observers, have described seeing objects entering or exiting bodies of water. Not crashing, not splashing, moving in and out of the ocean smoothly, as though the boundary between air and water did not affect them. These objects are sometimes referred to as USOs, unidentified submerged objects. Naval personnel have occasionally reported tracking objects underwater that move at speeds far beyond known submarine capabilities. Fishermen have described lights beneath the surface, moving rapidly through the water. Coastal observers have described objects descending into the ocean without disturbance, or rising out of it and accelerating into the sky. These accounts are not as widely known as the major UFO cases, but they form a consistent enough pattern that some researchers consider them a distinct subset of the phenomenon. Then there are the reports of objects interacting with land in unusual ways. Some witnesses have described craft appearing to emerge from mountainsides, or descending into terrain without any visible opening. These accounts are rarer, and often more difficult to verify, but they feed into the broader idea that there may be hidden entry points, locations where whatever these objects are can move between environments we consider separate. From this foundation, the theory becomes more specific. One of the most well-known variations is the Dulce Base theory. Dulce is a small town in northern New Mexico, located near the Colorado border on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation. According to the theory, deep beneath this area lies a vast underground facility, not a natural cavern, but a constructed base extending multiple levels below the surface. In this narrative, the base is operated jointly by the US government and extraterrestrial beings, and is used for research, including, in some versions, genetic and biological experimentation. The story is most closely associated with a man named Phil Schneider, Schneider described himself as a geological engineer who had worked on the construction of deep underground military bases. In the early 1990s, he began giving lectures in which he described his experiences. According to his account, during a drilling operation in New Mexico, his team accidentally broke into a subterranean space occupied by grey alien beings. What followed, he claimed, was a violent confrontation in which several people were killed. Schneider said he was injured during the incident and later shown classified information about a long-standing agreement between the US government and these beings. These are extraordinary claims. Schneider presented photographs, diagrams, and physical samples during his lectures. He spoke with a sense of urgency, stating that the public had a right to know what was happening beneath the surface. His talks gained attention within UFO and conspiracy research circles. In 1996, Schneider was found dead in his apartment. His death was ruled a suicide. Supporters of his story questioned that conclusion, suggesting that he had been silenced. Skeptics pointed to inconsistencies in his claims, lack of verifiable employment records, and the absence of corroborating evidence. As with many stories in this space, the truth remains difficult to pin down. Mainstream geology offers a very different picture of the Earth's interior, through seismic studies measuring how earthquake waves travel through the planet. Scientists have developed a detailed model of its structure: a solid crust, a semi-fluid mantle, a molten outer core, and a solid inner core. This model is supported by extensive data. It does not leave room for vast open caverns of the kind described in hollow earth theories, and yet, even within this framework, there are spaces beneath the surface that are not fully explored. Cave systems that extend for miles, deep ocean trenches that remain largely unmapped, underground military facilities that are real, though far more limited in scale than the ones described in the more elaborate theories. The UFO phenomenon, meanwhile, remains an area of genuine uncertainty. While many sightings can be attributed to known objects, submarines, marine life, natural phenomena, some reports, particularly those involving high-speed movement without visible propulsion, have not been conclusively explained. So the theory sits in an unusual place. On one side, there is a well-established scientific understanding of the Earth's structure that leaves little room for hidden civilizations beneath our feet. On the other, there is a collection of accounts, some credible, some less so, describing objects interacting with water and terrain in ways that are not fully understood. Between those two, there is space, not necessarily for a conclusion, but for a question. If something can move through the sky in ways we do not yet understand, could it also move through environments we assume are barriers? If something is here, whatever here means, does it need to come from far away? Or could it already be part of the world we think we know? The hollow earth and underground base theories attempt to answer those questions in a very specific way. Whether that answer is correct is another matter entirely. But the shift they introduce, from the distant to the hidden, changes the feeling of the mystery. It is no longer just above us. It is, possibly, below the grey alien abduction phenomenon. Perhaps no aspect of UFO mythology is more personal or more psychologically complex than the abduction narrative. Most UFO sightings happen at a distance, a light in the sky, an object moving across the horizon, something seen, described, and then gone. The abduction accounts are different. They are not about something far away. They are about something close. Something that, according to the people who experience it, happens to them. That shift from observation to experience is what makes this part of the phenomenon feel so different. Beginning most prominently in the 1960s and 1970s, a pattern of reports began to emerge. People from different parts of the world, with no connection to each other, describing remarkably similar events. They spoke of being taken, often at night, often from their homes or from isolated roads. They described small beings, grey in colour, with large, dark, almond-shaped eyes, thin limbs, and minimal facial features. They described being examined, sometimes medically, sometimes in ways that were difficult to articulate, and they described being returned, often with only fragments of memory, a sense that time had been lost. There is a phrase often associated with these cases, missing time. People would realize that hours had passed without their awareness, that they had arrived somewhere later than expected, that their memory of a period of time was incomplete or absent. It is from this gap that many of the more detailed accounts later emerged, often through hypnosis or guided recall. The first widely publicized case, the one that brought this pattern into public awareness, involved a couple named Betty and Barney Hill. In September of 1961, the Hills were driving back to their home in New Hampshire after a vacation in Canada. It was late at night. The road was quiet. At some point during the drive, they noticed a light in the sky. At first, they thought it might be a satellite or an aircraft, but the light seemed to move in ways that did not match anything they recognized. It appeared to follow their car. They stopped at one point to observe it more closely through binoculars. Barney later described seeing figures inside the object. Feeling uneasy, they returned to their car and continued driving. What happened next is where the account becomes difficult to reconstruct. They arrived home approximately 2 hours later than they expected, with no clear memory of what had happened during that time. In the days that followed, both of them experienced anxiety, vivid dreams, and a persistent sense that something had occurred that they could not fully recall. Years later, under hypnosis, they described being taken aboard a craft. They described the beings small, grey, with large eyes. They described being separated and examined. Betty described being shown a map, a three-dimensional star map, she said, indicating trade routes and home systems. A researcher named Marjorie Fish later attempted to interpret that map and concluded that it corresponded to the Zeta Reticuli star system, a pair of stars located approximately 39 light-years from Earth. The Hill case became a template, not because it was proven, but because it was detailed. It contained many of the elements that would appear again and again in later accounts. Over the following decades, thousands of similar reports surfaced, from different countries, different cultures, different backgrounds, people who had no apparent reason to fabricate such experiences, and often strong reasons not to. Many were reluctant to speak publicly. Some waited years before telling anyone at all. The consistency of the descriptions is one of the most striking features. The beings, the environment, the procedures, the sense of calm mixed with fear, the partial amnesia. These elements appear again and again, with variations but with a recognizable core. Psychiatrist John Mack took these accounts seriously. Mack was not an obscure figure. He was a Harvard professor, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, a clinician with a long and respected career. When he began studying abduction reports, he did so with the tools of his discipline, careful interviews, attention to psychological detail, an attempt to understand what his subjects were experiencing rather than dismissing it outright. After years of work, Mack arrived at a conclusion that was both cautious and controversial. He did not claim that his patients were being physically taken by extraterrestrial beings in a way that could be measured and verified. But he was clear about something else. The experiences they described were real to them, not fantasies, not simple fabrications. They had a depth, a consistency, and an emotional impact that suggested something significant was happening. He described the phenomenon as having a kind of psychological or spiritual reality, something that existed at the edge of what conventional frameworks could easily explain. His work was not universally accepted. Harvard conducted an internal inquiry into his research, an unusual step that reflected how seriously his claims were being taken and how controversial they were. Mack continued his work until his death in 2004, maintaining that the phenomenon deserved careful study rather than dismissal. Skeptical researchers have offered several alternative explanations. Sleep paralysis is one of the most frequently cited. It is a well-documented condition in which a person wakes up while their body is still in a state of paralysis associated with REM sleep. During these episodes, people often report a sense of presence in the room, an inability to move, and vivid, sometimes terrifying hallucinations. The experience can feel entirely real. The figures seen during sleep paralysis episodes are often described in ways that overlap with the grey alien archetype. False memory syndrome is another explanation. Memory is not fixed. It can be influenced by suggestion, especially under conditions like hypnosis. Some researchers argue that the process of hypnotic regression, used in many abduction cases to recover lost memories, can unintentionally create detailed but inaccurate recollections. There is also the idea of cultural transmission. The image of the grey alien has become deeply embedded in popular culture, in films, television, books, and media. Once that image exists, it can shape how people interpret unusual experiences, dreams, or states of consciousness. These explanations account for many aspects of the phenomenon. They are grounded in established psychological principles, and they are taken seriously by a large portion of the scientific community. But for some researchers, they do not fully account for everything. They do not fully explain the consistency of reports across time and geography. They do not fully explain cases that predate widespread cultural exposure to the grey alien image. They do not fully explain the intensity and life-altering impact these experiences often have on the people who report them. And so the question remains open. What is undeniable is this: thousands of people around the world report these experiences. They are not all the same, but they share a recognizable structure. And for the individuals who live through them, whatever their origin, the effects are real. They carry the memory, they carry the uncertainty, and often they carry the question for the rest of their lives. It is a quieter part of the UFO story, less visible than lights in the sky, but in some ways more difficult to dismiss. The Sirius and Dogon theory in the 1970s, a book appeared that added a new and unusual layer to the conversation around ancient knowledge and possible extraterrestrial contact. The book was called The Sirius Mystery, written by Robert Temple, and it centered on a claim that, at first hearing, feels both specific and difficult to ignore. The claim was this: that the Dogon people of Mali, in West Africa, possessed detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system, knowledge that, according to Temple, they should not have had. Sirius is the brightest star in the night sky. It is easily visible to the naked eye, and it has been observed and recorded by human cultures for thousands of years. But Sirius is not a single star. It is a binary system. Alongside Sirius A, the bright star we can see, there is a much smaller companion star known as Sirius B. Sirius B is a white dwarf. It is extremely dense, very faint, and not visible without the aid of a telescope. Its existence was first inferred in the 19th century through careful observation of Sirius A's motion, and it was confirmed by Western astronomers in 1862. Even then, it remained difficult to observe directly. It was not photographed until 1970 using advanced astronomical equipment. This is where the Dogon enter the story. Anthropologists Marcel Grial and Germaine Dieterlen conducted studies of the Dogon people in the early to mid-20th century. In their published work, they described Dogon cosmology as including knowledge of a companion star to Sirius, a small, dense star that orbited the visible one. They also described the Dogon as having complex symbolic systems related to astronomy, including references to celestial cycles and structures. Temple took these descriptions and built an argument around them. If the Dogon truly possessed knowledge of Sirius B before it was discovered by Western science, he reasoned, then that knowledge must have come from somewhere. And because Sirius B is not visible to the naked eye, and because the Dogon did not have telescopes, the source of that knowledge could not have been conventional observation. His conclusion was that the Dogon must have received this knowledge from an advanced civilization. Specifically, he connected their traditions to beings described in Sumerian texts, the Nommo, whom he interpreted as extraterrestrial visitors from the Sirius system. It is a compelling narrative. It takes a real astronomical fact, the existence of Sirius B, and connects it to a real culture with rich symbolic traditions, and then proposes a bridge between them that feels both imaginative and, at least on the surface, logically consistent. For a time, the theory attracted significant attention, but as with many claims of this kind, it did not remain unchallenged. Later researchers returned to the Dogon communities to examine the claims more closely. What they found was more complex, and in some ways less mysterious than Temple had suggested. The astronomical knowledge attributed to the Dogon appeared, in these later studies, to be less precise and less clearly defined than originally reported. Some of the specific details about Sirius B, its density, its orbit, were not consistently present in Dogon oral traditions. There was also the question of timing. The Dogon had been in contact with European explorers, missionaries, and colonial administrators for decades before the anthropological studies were conducted. During that time, it is possible, and some researchers argue likely, that information about Western astronomy could have been introduced into the community, consciously or unconsciously incorporated into local knowledge systems, and later presented to researchers as part of traditional cosmology. This is not an accusation of deception. It is a recognition of how cultural exchange works. Information moves. Ideas blend. Stories adapt. Anthropology itself is not immune to influence. The way questions are asked, the expectations researchers bring with them, the interpretations they apply, all of these can shape the data that is collected. Some critics of the original Dogon studies have suggested that the researchers may have, unintentionally, guided the conversations in ways that emphasized certain interpretations over others. So the foundation of the Sirius-Dogon connection, as presented in the Sirius Mystery, becomes less stable under closer examination. And yet, the story does not entirely disappear, because beneath the specific claims about Sirius B, there is a broader and more enduring question, one that does not depend on any single culture or any single star system. How did ancient and pre-modern societies understand the sky as well as they did? Across the world, long before the invention of modern instruments, human beings tracked the movements of stars and planets with remarkable precision. They built calendars based on celestial cycles. They aligned structures with astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, the rising and setting of specific stars. They developed mythologies that encoded observations of the sky in symbolic language that could be passed down through generations. This knowledge did not come from nowhere. It came from careful observation, from patience, from watching the sky night after night, year after year, generation after generation, and noticing patterns. The Dogon, like many cultures, have a rich cosmology. Their stories, symbols, and rituals reflect a deep engagement with the natural world, including the sky. Whether or not those traditions included precise knowledge of an invisible companion star, they represent a sophisticated attempt to understand humanity's place in a much larger universe. The ancient astronaut interpretation adds another layer to that story. It suggests that some of that knowledge may have come from beyond the Earth, that contact with another intelligence may have shaped human understanding in ways we do not fully recognize. Most scholars do not find that conclusion necessary. They see in the available evidence a more grounded explanation, one that attributes ancient knowledge to human observation, cultural transmission, and the gradual accumulation of understanding over time. But the question that draws people to the Sirius, Dogon theory remains quietly compelling. Not necessarily because it proves anything, but because it invites us to consider how much we still do not know about how knowledge moves, how stories form, and how human beings across time and place have tried to make sense of the stars above them. And in that sense, whether the answer lies in distant civilizations or in the careful work of people watching the sky with the naked eye, the mystery retains its shape. It remains something worth thinking about. The reptilian hypothesis, and then there are those who take this considerably further. Up to this point, many of the theories we have explored have stayed, at least loosely, within the boundaries of observation. Lights in the sky, objects on radar, personal experiences that, while difficult to explain, are still described in terms of events, things seen, things felt, things remembered. The reptilian hypothesis moves away from events and towards something broader, something more systemic. It is not just about encounters, it is about control. The theory is most closely associated with David Icke, a British author who began developing and publishing these ideas in the 1990s. His central claim is that a non-human species, described as reptilian in origin, has been interacting with humanity for thousands of years, not openly, but from behind the scenes. According to this framework, these beings are capable of shape-shifting or otherwise appearing human. They are said to occupy positions of influence across global systems, in governments, financial institutions, media organizations, and other centers of power. The visible structures of society, in this view, are only the surface. Beneath them is a hidden layer of coordination, guided by entities whose true nature is concealed. It is a theory that attempts to explain not a single mystery, but many at once. Political instability, economic inequality, war, cultural shifts. Patterns that, to some observers, feel too consistent or too coordinated to be the result of chance or ordinary human decision-making. The reptilian hypothesis offers a single, unifying answer, that there is an intelligence guiding these outcomes from behind the scenes. In that sense, it belongs to a category of ideas sometimes called grand, unified conspiracies. The goal is not to explain one event, but to provide a framework that explains everything. The imagery associated with the theory is striking. Reptilian beings are often described as tall, humanoid, with scaled skin, vertical pupils, and a presence that feels both intelligent and predatory. In some versions of the story, they are said to originate from other star systems or dimensions. In others, they are described as having been on Earth for a very long time, interacting with human civilization in cycles that stretch back into prehistory. These details vary depending on the source. What remains consistent is the central idea of hidden influence. Within UFO research itself, this theory is generally not accepted. Many investigators who study aerial phenomena, military encounters, or even abduction reports draw a clear line between their work and claims of global control by shape-shifting entities. They view the reptilian hypothesis as speculative at best, and as something that risks undermining more grounded lines of inquiry. There are also more serious criticisms. Some versions of the theory, particularly when they describe secret groups controlling world systems, overlap with older conspiracy narratives that have been linked to anti-Semitic ideas. Even when not explicitly stated, the structure of the claim, a hidden elite manipulating global events, can echo patterns that have historically been used to target specific communities. Because of this, the theory has been widely criticized, not only for lack of evidence, but for the potential harm embedded in some of its interpretations. This is an important distinction. It is one thing to question power, to ask who holds it, how it is used, and whether it is exercised transparently. That is a long-standing and legitimate line of inquiry present in journalism, political theory, and public discourse. It is another thing to attribute that power to a hidden, non-human group operating in secret, without verifiable evidence, and in ways that can blur into harmful generalizations. The reptilian hypothesis sits at that boundary, and often crosses it. And yet, despite these criticisms, the idea continues to circulate. Part of its persistence may lie in how it simplifies complexity. The world is complicated. Events rarely have a single cause. Systems are influenced by countless decisions, incentives, and unintended consequences. That complexity can feel unsatisfying. It can feel incomplete. A theory that offers a single explanation, even an extraordinary one, can feel, in a certain way, more coherent. It replaces uncertainty with structure. It also reflects a deeper and more universal concern, the question of trust. Who is making decisions that affect millions of people? How transparent are those decisions? Are their interests operating out of view? These questions do not require a reptilian answer to be meaningful. They exist in everyday discussions about governance, economics, and media. The reptilian hypothesis can be seen, in part, as an extreme extension of those concerns. It takes a grounded question, whether power is fully visible and accountable, and extends it into a realm where the actors themselves are no longer human, and the mechanisms of influence are no longer observable. At that point, the theory becomes difficult to test. There is no clear way to confirm it. There is no agreed-upon method to falsify it. Evidence is often interpreted through the lens of the theory itself, rather than used to evaluate it from the outside. This is one of the reasons it remains outside mainstream inquiry, and yet, as an idea, it occupies a certain place in the broader landscape of conspiracy thinking. It represents one end of a spectrum. At the beginning of that spectrum are questions that are widely accepted as reasonable. Questions about transparency, accountability, and the concentration of power. As one moves along the spectrum, the explanations become more expansive, more speculative, and less connected to verifiable evidence. The reptilian hypothesis sits at the far edge of that progression. Whether one encounters it as a curiosity, a belief, or something to be critically examined, it reflects a pattern that appears again and again in human storytelling. The attempt to make sense of complex systems by imagining an unseen force that brings them into order. In that sense, even this theory, as unusual as it may seem, connects back to a familiar place. The desire to understand who or what is really in control, and whether what we see on the surface is the whole story. The counterpoint layer. The interdimensional hypothesis this theory is, in some ways, the most philosophically interesting of the more fringe ideas. It does not begin with the assumption that UFOs are spacecraft traveling from one point in physical space to another. It begins with a different question entirely. What if the framework we are using to interpret the phenomenon is too narrow? The interdimensional hypothesis suggests that UFOs and the beings sometimes associated with them are not visitors from another planet in our universe, but from another layer of reality, another dimension, or plane of existence. That exists alongside our own, but is not normally accessible to us. In this view, the phenomenon is not crossing vast distances through space. It is crossing boundaries of a different kind. This idea attempts to account for certain patterns that have appeared consistently in UFO reports over time. Patterns that do not fit easily into a straightforward extraterrestrial model. One of those patterns is the way objects are often described as appearing and disappearing. Witnesses frequently report lights or craft that seem to materialize suddenly, without approaching from a distance, and then vanish just as abruptly, not accelerating away in a visible trajectory, but simply no longer present. In a conventional physical framework, this is difficult to explain. Objects move through space along continuous paths. They do not simply blink in and out of existence. Another pattern is the reported behavior of the objects themselves. In some cases, they appear to move in ways that do not follow known physical constraints. Instant changes in direction, sudden acceleration without visible propulsion. Movement that suggests not just advanced technology, but a different relationship to space and motion altogether. Then there are the encounters that involve more than observation. In some reports, particularly those involving close encounters or abduction-like experiences, witnesses describe a sense that the beings involved are aware of their thoughts. Communication is sometimes described as telepathic. Information appears to be exchanged without speech. There is a sense, in these accounts, that the boundary between observer and observed becomes less defined. These features have led some researchers to consider whether the phenomenon might not be entirely physical in the way we usually understand that term. Jacques Vallée is one of the most prominent figures associated with this line of thinking. Vallée is not a fringe figure in the conventional sense. He is a trained astronomer and computer scientist. He has contributed to early work in networked computing. He has spent decades studying UFO reports, not as isolated stories, but as a body of data, cataloguing cases, looking for patterns, comparing accounts across time and geography. What he found did not lead him to a simple conclusion. Vallée became convinced that the phenomenon was real in the sense that people were experiencing something consistent and structured. But he also concluded that the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the idea that these are spacecraft from other planets, did not fully account for the data. Instead, he noticed similarities between modern UFO encounters and much older accounts from human history. Stories of encounters with non-human entities, beings described as fairies, spirits, or otherworldly visitors. Events involving missing time, altered perception, or journeys to unfamiliar realms. In different cultural contexts, these experiences were interpreted in different ways, but the underlying patterns, Vallée argued, showed a kind of continuity. From this perspective, the phenomenon might not be new. It might be something that has been interacting with human perception for a very long time, presenting itself in forms that fit the cultural expectations of the period. In earlier centuries, it might have appeared as something mystical or supernatural. In the modern era, it appears as technological, spacecraft, beings from other planets, because that is the framework we have available to interpret it. If that is the case, then the question changes. Instead of asking where these objects come from in space, the question becomes what they are in a more fundamental sense. Are they physical objects at all? Are they manifestations of some form of intelligence that operates in a way we do not yet understand? Are they interacting with consciousness as much as with the physical world? Vallée has been careful not to claim definitive answers. He has emphasized uncertainty. He has resisted conclusions that go beyond the available evidence. What he has argued is that the phenomenon behaves in ways that suggest it is not simply a matter of advanced vehicles traveling between stars. It may be something that intersects with our reality rather than moving through it in the conventional sense. This is where the idea becomes more abstract. The concept of dimensions beyond the familiar three dimensions of space and one of time is not purely speculative. In physics, certain theoretical models, particularly in areas like string theory, propose the existence of additional dimensions that are not directly observable. These ideas are mathematical, not experiential. They describe structures that, if they exist, are far removed from everyday perception. The interdimensional hypothesis takes a step beyond that. It suggests that there may be forms of existence that occupy these other layers, and that under certain conditions, interaction between those layers and our own becomes possible. Not continuously, but intermittently. Not predictably, but in ways that leave traces, sightings, encounters, experiences that resist simple explanation. This is not something that can be easily tested. Conventional scientific methods rely on repeatability, measurement, and controlled observation. A phenomenon that is sporadic, subjective, and possibly linked to consciousness presents challenges to that framework. It does not mean it is impossible to study, but it does mean that the tools required may not yet be fully developed. For that reason, the interdimensional hypothesis remains, for now, a conceptual model rather than a confirmed explanation. And yet, it holds a certain appeal. It does not reduce the phenomenon to a single, concrete answer. It leaves space for ambiguity. It allows for the possibility that what people are encountering is not just unfamiliar, but fundamentally different from the categories we are used to working with. It also shifts the scale of the question. If UFOs are spacecraft, then the mystery is one of distance. How far have they traveled? From which star system? With what technology? If they are interdimensional, then the mystery is one of reality itself. What is the structure of the world we inhabit? How many layers does it have? And how much of it do we actually perceive? Valley's work does not resolve these questions. It reframes them. And in doing so, it suggests that the phenomenon, whatever its origin, may be pointing not just outward, into space, but inward, toward the limits of our understanding, and the possibility that those limits are not where we think they are. What mainstream science says, of course, not everyone finds these theories convincing. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Because skepticism, in this context, is not simply dismissal. It is often the result of careful, methodical thinking applied over long periods of time. Many of the people who question UFO claims are not uninterested observers. They are scientists, engineers, astronomers, and investigators who have looked closely at the same reports and arrived at more cautious conclusions. The scientific consensus, broadly speaking, takes a measured position. It holds that life elsewhere in the universe is very likely. The sheer scale of the cosmos makes that possibility difficult to ignore. There are hundreds of billions of galaxies. Each galaxy contains billions of stars. Many of those stars have planets. In recent decades, the discovery of exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars, has confirmed that planetary systems are common. From that perspective, it would be surprising if life had emerged only once. But there is a difference between believing that life exists somewhere and claiming that it has visited here. Science draws a clear line between those two ideas. As of now, there is no verified, widely accepted evidence that intelligent extraterrestrial beings have made contact with Earth. This does not mean that all UFO sightings are explained. It does not mean that every report has been resolved. It means that none of the available evidence meets the standard required to confirm such an extraordinary claim. That standard is deliberately high. In science, evidence must be consistent, reproducible, and independently verified. A single photograph, especially if it is unclear or lacks context, is not enough. Radar data, while valuable, can sometimes be misinterpreted or affected by technical limitations. Human testimony, even when sincere and detailed, is subject to perception, memory, and interpretation. Each of these forms of evidence can be meaningful, but on their own, they are not conclusive. Carl Sagan expressed this idea in a way that has become widely quoted: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Sagan was not dismissive of the possibility of extraterrestrial life. In fact, he was one of its most thoughtful advocates. He helped establish the SETI Institute, which searches for signals from intelligent civilizations beyond Earth. He spent much of his career considering how such contact might occur and what it would mean. But he was also careful. He reviewed UFO reports with interest, but he did not find in them the level of evidence required to conclude that they represented alien visitation. For Sagan, curiosity and skepticism were not opposites. They worked together. One opened the door to possibility. The other ensured that conclusions were grounded in reliable evidence. This is the position mainstream science continues to hold. There are phenomena that remain unexplained, objects that have been observed but not fully identified, patterns that invite further study. But there is an important distinction between saying, "We do not yet understand this," and saying, "This must come from another world." The first is an open question. The second is a specific answer. And for now, science remains with the question. The psychology of seeing human perception is imperfect. This is not a criticism of any individual witness. It is a basic feature of how the human mind works. Our brains are designed to interpret the world quickly. We are constantly processing incomplete information and turning it into something meaningful. This ability is useful. It helps us recognize faces, detect movement, and respond to our environment. But it also means that what we perceive is not always an exact representation of what is there. Instead, it is a construction. We rely on patterns. We look for familiar shapes. When something is unclear, distant lights, unusual motion, objects seen in low visibility, the brain fills in the gaps. It offers its best interpretation based on past experience and expectation. Most of the time this works well, but under certain conditions, those interpretations can be inaccurate. The sky, especially at night, creates many of those conditions. There are natural phenomena that can appear unusual, even intentional, if you are not expecting them. Ball lightning, for example, is a rare but documented event in which glowing spheres of energy appear and move through the air. Their motion can seem controlled, almost deliberate. Lenticular clouds, shaped by airflow over mountains, can form smooth, disc-like structures that resemble the classic idea of a flying saucer. Even familiar objects can behave in unfamiliar ways. The planet Venus is often bright enough to be mistaken for something closer, especially when it is low on the horizon and affected by atmospheric distortion. It can appear to flicker, shift, or even move slightly due to the way light bends through layers of air. Satellites, reflecting sunlight, can cross the sky quickly and silently. Space debris can produce brief flashes that seem to appear and disappear without warning. Each of these has a physical explanation, but in the moment, without context, they can feel unexplained. This does not account for every report. Some sightings remain difficult to categorize, but it does explain a portion of them, and careful investigators take that into account. There is also the question of memory. We tend to think of memory as something stable, like a recording that can be replayed. In reality, memory is more flexible than that. Each time we recall an event, we reconstruct it. That reconstruction can be influenced by emotion, by later information, and by the way questions are asked. If an experience is intense, especially if it involves fear or confusion, the memory of it can change over time. Details can become sharper or less clear. New elements can be introduced without the person realizing it. This is not deception. It is how memory functions. This becomes particularly important in cases where hypnosis is used. Hypnotic regression has been used in some abduction investigations to recover what are believed to be hidden memories. However, many psychologists caution that hypnosis increases suggestibility. It can lead individuals to form detailed memories that feel real but may not correspond to actual events. Because of this, testimony alone, even when sincere, is not considered conclusive evidence. It is valuable, it is worth listening to, but it needs to be supported by additional forms of verification when possible. This perspective does not dismiss the experiences people report. It places them within a framework that recognizes both the strengths and the limits of human perception. Where conspiracy researchers disagree, one of the more revealing aspects of UFO research is not agreement, but disagreement. From the outside, it can be easy to imagine that people who question official explanations are working from a shared set of beliefs. But within the UFO research community itself, there is no single unified position. Instead, there is a wide range of interpretations, often in direct conflict with one another. Some researchers are firmly committed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. They view UFOs as physical craft from other star systems, piloted by non-human intelligences. In this view, the central question is not whether contact has occurred, but how often, and how much of it has been concealed. Others take a more cautious approach. Researchers like Jacques Vallée argue that the extraterrestrial explanation may be too narrow to account for the full range of reported phenomena. They point to patterns that suggest something more complex, something that may not fit neatly into the idea of spacecraft traveling through space in a conventional sense. There are also divisions around the role of governments. Some believe there is an active, coordinated effort to conceal evidence of UFOs and extraterrestrial contact. This perspective often focuses on classified programs, restricted information, and the possibility that key data is being deliberately withheld from the public. Others, however, see the situation differently. They suggest that governments may not have clear answers themselves. In this view, the lack of transparency is not necessarily a sign of hidden knowledge, but of uncertainty. Admitting we don't know, especially in matters related to national security, can be difficult for institutions that are expected to project control and understanding. The abduction phenomenon is another point of division. Some researchers consider it a central part of the UFO mystery, deserving serious investigation. They point to patterns in testimony and the consistency of reported experiences. Others in the same community are more skeptical. They interpret these accounts through the lens of psychology, focusing on sleep disorders, memory processes, and cultural influence. These disagreements are not minor. They reflect fundamentally different ways of interpreting the same body of reports. The same sighting, the same testimony, the same piece of data can lead to very different conclusions depending on the framework being applied. In one sense, this lack of consensus can be seen as a strength. It suggests that the field is not governed by a single dominant narrative. Researchers are not all moving in the same direction by default. They are evaluating evidence independently, drawing their own conclusions, and, in many cases, challenging each other's assumptions. But it also creates a more complicated picture for anyone trying to understand the subject. There is no single source that can provide a definitive account. There is no agreement on which cases are most reliable, which explanations are most plausible, or even which questions are most important to ask. Instead, there is a landscape of competing ideas. To engage with it requires patience. It requires a willingness to hold multiple possibilities at once, and to recognize that even within communities that question official narratives, certainty is often in short supply. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is what defines this area of inquiry. Not a single answer, but a continuing conversation. The open questions. The Fermi paradox there is one scientific puzzle that sits quietly alongside the UFO question, and it has been discussed for decades without a clear resolution. It is known as the Fermi paradox. The idea begins with a simple observation about scale. The universe is extremely old, about 13.8 billion years. Within it are hundreds of billions of galaxies. Each galaxy contains hundreds of billions of stars. And around many of those stars, we now know there are planets. In recent years, astronomy has confirmed that planetary systems are not rare. They are common. Some of those planets exist in regions where conditions could allow for liquid water, a key ingredient for life as we understand it. Given enough time and enough opportunities, it seems reasonable to expect that life would arise in more than one place. And not just simple life. If even a small fraction of those life-bearing planets developed intelligent beings, and if even a small fraction of those beings developed advanced technology, then over millions or billions of years, some of those civilizations could become far more advanced than our own. They could develop methods of communication we do not yet understand. They could travel between stars, they could leave detectable traces of their existence, and yet, when we look out into the universe, we do not see clear evidence of that. We have not detected unambiguous signals from another civilization. We have not observed structures or activities that can be confidently identified as artificial on an interstellar scale. The sky, as far as we can currently tell, appears quiet. This is the paradox. Given the vastness of the universe and the amount of time that has passed, the absence of clear evidence becomes something that needs explaining. There are many possible answers. Some suggest that intelligent life is extremely rare, that while simple organisms may exist in many places, the path to complex, technologically capable life is narrow and unlikely. Others propose that civilizations tend to destroy themselves before they reach a stage where they can explore or communicate across great distances. Technological development may carry risks that limit long-term survival. There is also the possibility that advanced civilizations exist, but choose not to broadcast their presence. They may have reasons to remain undetected, or methods of communication that do not rely on signals we can easily recognize. And then there is a more speculative idea. That evidence may exist, but we do not recognize it for what it is. That our assumptions about how advanced civilizations would behave may be too limited. That we are, in a sense, looking for something familiar in a universe that may not operate in familiar ways. This is where the connection to UFO discussions sometimes appears. Not as proof, but as a point of reflection. If the universe is as full of potential as it seems, then the absence of clear contact becomes a question rather than a conclusion. It does not confirm that anything unusual in our skies is extraterrestrial, but it leaves open the broader possibility that our understanding is incomplete. The Fermi paradox does not resolve that uncertainty, it frames it. And in doing so, it highlights something that is easy to overlook, that in science, saying we do not yet know is not a weakness. It is often the beginning of deeper understanding. What did the pilots actually see? We are getting close to the end of the story, not the end of the mystery, but the point where the details begin to settle into something quieter. And one question, more than most, tends to linger. What did the pilots actually see? Across decades, there have been consistent reports from military aviators. Individuals trained to observe, identify, and respond to objects in the sky under high-pressure conditions. These are not casual witnesses. Their work depends on accuracy. They are taught to recognize aircraft, track motion, estimate distance and speed, and remain composed while doing so. From Kenneth Arnold's sighting in the late 1940s to the encounters reported by US Navy pilots in the early 21st century, the descriptions share certain features. Objects moving at speeds that seem to exceed known capabilities. Sudden acceleration without visible propulsion. Direction changes that appear instantaneous without the gradual arcs expected from conventional aircraft. No wings. No rotors. No visible exhaust. No sonic boom, even at high velocity. In some cases, these observations are not limited to human perception. They are supported by radar data, by infrared tracking systems, by multiple pilots observing the same object from different positions. This combination, visual confirmation paired with instrumentation, is part of what makes these cases difficult to dismiss outright. One of the most discussed examples is the encounter described by Commander David Fravor in 2004. During a training exercise off the coast of California, Fravor and other pilots were directed to investigate an unusual radar contact. What they reported was an object shaped roughly like a smooth, elongated capsule, often described as a tic-tac. It appeared to move erratically, hovering and then accelerating rapidly. At one point, it seemed to mirror the aircraft's movements before quickly departing the area. Radar operators later reported that the object reappeared at a distant location in a very short amount of time. Accounts like this do not provide clear answers, but they do establish something important, that there are observations made by credible, trained individuals, sometimes supported by multiple systems, that do not fit neatly into existing categories of known technology or natural phenomena. At the same time, caution remains necessary. Even highly trained observers can encounter situations that challenge perception. Speed, distance, and scale can be difficult to judge in open airspace. Instrumentation, while reliable, is not infallible. Data can be incomplete. Context can be missing. There are also possibilities that fall within known human activity. Classified technology is one. Military research, by its nature, is not fully public. It is possible that some observed objects represent experimental systems, domestic or foreign, that are not widely known. This does not explain all cases, but it remains part of the conversation. And then there are explanations that have not yet been fully developed. Atmospheric effects, sensor interactions, phenomena that are real but not yet well understood. So the question remains, not as a conclusion, but as an open space. What were they seeing? The most careful answer from those who have studied these incidents closely is a simple one. We do not know. and rather than closing the discussion, that uncertainty keeps it alive. Why do so many accounts agree? As the stories begin to settle, one detail continues to stand out: the consistency. Across different countries, different decades, and very different cultural settings. People who describe close encounters with non-human beings often describe something remarkably similar. Small figures, grey or pale skin, large, dark eyes, thin limbs, minimal facial features. And beyond the physical description, a shared emotional tone, a sense of encountering something intelligent, unfamiliar, and deeply other. At first glance, that level of agreement feels difficult to ignore. It suggests, at least on the surface, that people may be describing the same kind of experience. The most widely accepted explanation for this consistency is cultural transmission. The image of the grey alien became especially prominent in the late 20th century, appearing in films, television, books, and widely publicized abduction accounts. Once that image entered popular culture, it provided a template, a shared visual language that people could draw from, consciously or not, when interpreting unusual experiences. This is not unusual. Human perception is shaped by expectation. When we encounter something unclear, a shadow, a dream, a moment between waking and sleep, the mind often fills in the details using familiar patterns. If a particular image becomes widespread, it can influence how those experiences are remembered and described. There is evidence that this process has occurred. Some abduction narratives from the 1970s and 80s closely match the imagery circulating in media at the time. Details such as the shape of the eyes, the structure of the body, even the environment inside the craft, appear to evolve alongside cultural representations. And yet, the picture is not entirely simple. There are accounts that seem to predate the widespread popularity of the grey alien image. Earlier reports, while sometimes less detailed, include descriptions that overlap with the now familiar form. There are also reports from regions with less exposure to Western media that still describe beings with similar characteristics. These cases are fewer, and often less well documented, but they complicate the idea that the image is purely a modern invention. Another possibility lies in shared features of human cognition. Certain visual patterns are more likely to emerge in dreams or altered states of consciousness. Large eyes, for example, are a strong visual signal. They draw attention. They can convey emotion or intention even without other facial features. In low light or ambiguous conditions, the human brain may be more likely to construct figures with exaggerated eyes and simplified forms. There is also the hypnagogic state, the transitional phase between waking and sleep. During this state, people can experience vivid imagery, a sense of presence, and sometimes paralysis. These experiences can feel external and real, even though they originate within the mind. Some researchers have suggested that this state may account for certain aspects of close encounter reports, including the consistency of the figures described. But even these explanations do not fully close the question. They offer plausible mechanisms, they account for patterns, but they do not completely explain why the same specific image appears so persistently across different contexts with such recognizable features. So the consistency remains, not as proof of any single explanation, but as a detail that invites continued attention. It may reflect something about culture, something about the human mind, or something else that has not yet been clearly understood. For now, it sits quietly within the larger mystery, recognizable and unresolved. What is in the classified files? As the discussion moves closer to the present day, the focus shifts from distant sightings and personal accounts to something more concrete, but still largely hidden. Government records. By any reasonable estimate, a significant number of documents related to unidentified aerial phenomena remain classified. This is not unusual in itself. Governments classify information for many reasons: national security, protection of technology, intelligence methods, and sometimes simply to avoid revealing uncertainty. Within those files, there is likely a wide range of material. Some of it is probably routine. Reports written after unusual sightings. Internal communications discussing how to respond to public inquiries. Analyses that ultimately conclude a sighting was a misidentified aircraft, a weather event, or a sensor anomaly. There is also likely material related to classified technology. Military aviation has always included experimental programs, some of which remain undisclosed for years or decades. It is possible that certain sightings, especially those involving unusual flight characteristics, are connected to systems that were not publicly acknowledged at the time. But there is also the possibility, and this is what draws continued attention, that some of the material is less easily explained. In recent years, there has been a noticeable shift in how governments, particularly in the United States, address this subject. The establishment of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office reflects an effort to centralize and systematically study reports of unidentified objects across air, sea, and space domains. There have also been public hearings. Testimony from individuals such as David Grush has brought renewed attention to the idea that governments may possess information not yet shared with the public. Grush, a former intelligence official, has claimed that programs exist to recover and study unidentified craft. These claims are significant, but they remain unverified in the public domain. This is where the uncertainty deepens. On one hand, the existence of classified material suggests that there is more information than what has been released. On the other, classification does not necessarily imply extraordinary content. It may reflect caution, bureaucracy, or the complexities of managing sensitive information. The question becomes not just what is hidden, but why it is hidden. Is it because the information points to something unfamiliar and potentially disruptive? Or because it reflects decades of incomplete understanding, inconsistent reporting, and the difficulty of admitting uncertainty within institutions that are expected to provide clarity? There is also the practical reality of time. Some classified material is eventually declassified. Documents are released. Programs are acknowledged. This process can take years, sometimes decades. It is possible that at least part of the current mystery will become clearer as more information is made public. But it is equally possible that some details will remain obscured. Governments, when they choose to, are capable of maintaining secrecy over long periods. Not perfectly, but effectively enough that full clarity is never achieved. So the question remains open. Not as a dramatic revelation waiting just beyond reach, but as a gradual process, one that may reveal pieces over time, or leave gaps that are never fully filled. For now, the files exist, and what they contain is, at least in part, still unknown. Are we asking the right question? As the discussion comes to rest, one idea lingers longer than the others. Not a theory, exactly, more a shift in perspective. Jack Foley's most enduring contribution may not be a specific explanation of UFOs, but a challenge to the way the question itself is usually framed. For many years, the dominant question has been simple. Are these objects alien spacecraft? It is a clear question, and it invites a clear kind of answer, yes or no. But Valley suggested that this framing might be too narrow, not because the phenomenon is unreal. On the contrary, he took the reports seriously. But he observed that when a question is framed too tightly, it can limit what we are able to see. If we begin with the assumption that UFOs must either be extraterrestrial vehicles or misidentified natural objects, then those become the only two categories we consider. Everything we encounter is forced into one of them. This is not unique to UFO research. It is a broader feature of how human thinking works. We rely on frameworks to interpret the world. They help us organize information. They allow us to make sense of complex data. But they also create boundaries. They define what counts as a valid explanation and what does not. When those boundaries are too rigid, they can become a kind of filter. Evidence that supports the existing framework is accepted more easily. Evidence that does not fit is set aside, reinterpreted, or ignored. This can happen on all sides. Those who strongly believe in extraterrestrial explanations may emphasize details that support that view. Those who are committed to conventional explanations may do the same in the opposite direction. In both cases, the conclusion can shape the investigation. Vallee's suggestion was to step back from that dynamic, to consider the possibility that the phenomenon, whatever it is, might not fit neatly into the categories we currently have available, that it might be real, but also unfamiliar in a way that requires new concepts rather than existing ones. This does not mean abandoning rigor. It does not mean accepting every claim without scrutiny. It means allowing for the possibility that the answer, if there is one, might not resemble the options we have been debating. Instead of asking, "Is this an alien spacecraft?" the question becomes broader. What is this? Is it a physical object in the conventional sense? Is it something that interacts with perception as much as with matter? Is it a phenomenon that sits at the intersection of multiple domains, physical, psychological, perhaps even cultural? These are more difficult questions. They do not lead quickly to conclusions. They open space rather than close it. And that may be why they matter, because in subjects like this, where clear answers remain out of reach, the way the question is asked can shape everything that follows. A narrow question can lead to a narrow search. A wider question can make room for possibilities that have not yet been fully considered. So the final idea is not an answer. It is a quiet adjustment. A recognition that before deciding what the phenomenon is, it may be worth asking whether we have been asking the right question about it at all. And that, in itself, keeps the mystery open. What does this say about us? As the details begin to fade into the background, what remains is something quieter. Not a specific theory, not a single piece of evidence, but the way human beings continue to return to this question, again and again. Whatever UFOs ultimately are, our relationship with the idea of them reveals something about us. For as long as people have been able to look up, they have done so with a sense of curiosity. Long before modern science, the sky was a place of stories. It held gods, spirits, ancestors, watchers. It was not empty. It was alive with meaning. Even as our understanding of the cosmos has grown more precise, that instinct has not disappeared. It has changed shape. Today, instead of gods, we imagine civilizations. Instead of mythological beings, we imagine intelligence from elsewhere. The language has shifted from the spiritual to the technological, but the underlying impulse feels familiar. A sense that what we see is not all that there is. Part of this may come from scale. The universe is vast in a way that is difficult to fully grasp. Billions of galaxies, trillions of stars, distances so large that light itself takes years to travel between points. Within that scale, the idea that life exists only here can feel unlikely. The possibility that something else might exist, and might in some way be aware of us, carries both comfort and unease. It speaks to loneliness. The idea that we are not alone suggests connection, that there is something else out there, but it also introduces uncertainty. If something else exists, what is it like? How would it see us? What would that mean for the way we understand ourselves? There is also a quieter element, a kind of resistance. Human beings have always questioned the boundaries of what they are told. Official explanations, even when well supported, are rarely accepted without some degree of doubt. This is not always negative. It can lead to deeper inquiry, to new discoveries, to a willingness to explore beyond accepted limits. But it can also create a space where unanswered questions take on a life of their own. The UFO phenomenon exists, in part, within that space. It persists not only because of what is seen, but because of what is felt. The sense that the world might be more complex than it appears, that there are layers not yet understood, that the story is not complete. This does not depend on any one piece of evidence. Even if every sighting were explained, the larger question might remain. The question of whether we are alone. The question of how much we truly understand about the universe we inhabit. And perhaps that is why the subject endures. It offers something that is not easily resolved, a place where curiosity can continue without immediate closure. What we do know is that people have been asking these questions for a long time, across generations, across cultures, in different forms but with a similar feeling behind them. And that persistence in itself may be the most revealing detail, not necessarily about what is out there, but about what it means to be here, looking up and wondering. The sleep outro tonight, we travelled a long way, not in distance exactly, but in ideas, in possibilities, in the quiet space between what is known and what is still uncertain. We began in a very specific place, a stretch of land in New Mexico, in the summer of 1947. A rancher walking across familiar ground, noticing something unfamiliar scattered across it. Light materials, unusual textures, objects that did not seem to belong to anything he recognized. That moment, small and local, became something larger over time. A story that spread. A question that did not settle. From there, the path widened. It led into the Nevada desert. Into places that are real, but not fully visible. Test sites. Restricted airspace. Facilities whose purposes are only partially known. Areas where advanced technology is developed, tested, and sometimes misidentified. Places where secrecy is expected and where uncertainty can grow quietly in the absence of clear information. Then the sky filled with people. Phoenix, in the late 1990s. Thousands of individuals looking upward at the same time. Lights moving in formation, silent, steady, crossing the horizon in a way that felt coordinated, but difficult to explain. Some saw structure, others saw only light. Cameras captured fragments, memories carried the rest. For a moment, the experience was shared. And then, like many of these moments, it passed into interpretation. From there, we moved into a cockpit, high above the Pacific Ocean. A trained pilot, instruments active, radar tracking something that did not behave as expected, an object without wings, without visible propulsion, moving in ways that did not match the known limits of aircraft design. Observed, tracked, and then gone. That moment, too, remains open, not dismissed, not confirmed, simply unresolved. And as the journey continued, it moved further outward, into older texts, ancient descriptions of things in the sky, words written long before modern technology, describing events in language shaped by the time in which they were recorded, interpretations layered onto interpretations, questions about whether those accounts were symbolic, literal, or something in between. Then, deeper still, into theories that extend beyond observation, underground spaces, hidden bases, possibilities beneath the surface of the Earth rather than above it, ideas that shift the location of the unknown from distant space to places much closer, but equally unseen, into accounts of beings not just observed, but encountered. Stories told quietly, sometimes reluctantly. Experiences that feel personal, difficult to share, and even more difficult to verify. The recurring image of the grey figure, the sense of being taken, examined, returned, memories that are partial, uncertain, but persistent. And alongside those stories, the voices of those who question them. Scientists, psychologists, investigators, people who look at the same accounts and see patterns of perception, of memory, of cultural influence. People who do not dismiss the experiences, but interpret them differently, who ask what the mind does in moments of stress, or darkness, or incomplete information. And then the broader questions about the universe itself, its size, its age, the possibility that life exists elsewhere, the paradox of not seeing clear evidence of it, the idea that absence of proof is not proof of absence, but also not confirmation of presence. And through all of this, one theme remains: uncertainty, not as a failure, but as a condition. At the end of this path, nothing has been fully resolved. The object seen over the Pacific remains unidentified. The lights over Phoenix remain debated. The accounts from New Mexico remain part history, part interpretation. The classified files remain, at least in part, closed. The witnesses continue to hold their experiences. The researchers continue to study them. And the questions continue to exist. But that is all right. Not every question is meant to be answered immediately. Some are meant to remain open, to be revisited, to be considered from different angles over time. The way you might look at something distant in the sky, not trying to define it too quickly, but allowing it to remain what it is for a while. Something observed, something not yet understood. Tonight, there is no need to decide. No need to choose between explanations. No need to settle on a conclusion that feels final. You do not need to believe in spacecraft from other stars. You do not need to believe in hidden bases or unseen dimensions. You do not need to resolve the tension between curiosity and skepticism. You can let all of it sit, quietly. The known, the unknown, the possibilities in between. Because whatever the truth of these stories may ultimately be, there are a few things that remain steady. The universe is vast, larger than it is easy to imagine, older than it is easy to comprehend, filled with structures and processes that are still being discovered, still being understood. Human beings are curious. We notice patterns. We ask questions. We tell stories to make sense of what we see. We look for meaning, even when meaning is not immediately available. And the sky above you is still there, unchanged by the theories we place onto it, present in the same quiet way it has always been. Whether it holds other life, other intelligence, or simply distant stars burning in silence, it remains something people have looked at with wonder for as long as there have been people to look. That is where we leave it tonight. Not with an answer, but with that sense of quiet awareness, that there is more to explore, and that it does not all need to be understood at once.